This is the city from which Germany has been governed since the Bismarck era. For 12 years, Berlin was the capital of the Third Reich. Buildings constructed by the Nazis can still be found in the city today. Though Hitler wasn't fond of Berlin, he did succeed in leaving a lasting impression on its cityscape. Relics from the National Socialist past turn up in unusual places. Hitler's aim was to transform Berlin into the future world capital of Germania. Some of the structures from that era provide an insight into his megalomaniac vision. When the Reich's fall became inevitable, Hitler opted to stay in the unloved capital until the end. The former local Gau headquarters at Friedrichshain survived the war and the fall of the Reich. Today, the building houses a publishing company. This massive construction was quite deliberately erected on this site in the mid-1930s, as it was right next door to a public hall in which Hitler's stormtroopers and the communists used to brawl at political meetings. True to the style of the National Socialist approach to art, the pompous staircase is lined with natural stone. Even though Gauleiter Joseph Goebbels was rarely seen here, the building's purpose was to keep the memory of the Nazi victory alive in Red Berlin. On Hitler's orders, Goebbels came to the capital of the Weimar Republic on the 9th of November 1926 with the mission to make the quarreling party members see reason. Within a few years, the talented propagandist transformed the radical splinter group into a powerful organization. Right next door to the Gau House, the Nazis built a housing estate for deserving fighters for the movement, which also survived the war. In honor of the Gauleiter, it was named Goebbels Heimstätte, or Goebbels Homestead. Berlin-based journalist Sven Felix Kellerhoff has been investigating the history of these well-preserved buildings for a long time. Many of his publications deal with the city's National Socialist past.
The strategy of Joseph Goebbels when he became the new Gauleiter can be summed up in a single word: provocation. He would deliberately send his stormtroopers to march across working-class areas, accepting the fact that many of his own people would get injured or even killed in the fighting, because he only had one goal. He wanted publicity, wanted to be noticed. His aim was to spread the notion in the German public that the communists were preparing for civil war and a revolution, so that he and the National Socialists would then appear as the saviors of the nation. And evidently, his strategy worked.
From the party headquarters at Wilhelmsplatz, Gauleiter Goebbels resolutely paved his Führer's way to power in Berlin. This building in the Zimmerstraße was bricked up during the GDR years as it bordered on the Berlin Wall. Up until the end of the war, it housed one of the head offices of Goebbels' propaganda instruments. It was the seat of the party newspapers Völkischer Beobachter and Angriff. After the accession to power in 1933, members of the opposition were tortured to death in its cellars. Yet the building marks an even more important event in the history of Hitler's Berlin. In 1927, the Führer gave his first official speech in the German capital in a dance club named Clou in this courtyard. As Hitler was banned from speaking publicly for many years, he gave his first speeches in Berlin at private meetings. After the ban was lifted, he would soon fill larger halls, such as the Neue Welt and the Sportpalast, with people willing to listen to his inflammatory anti-Semitic speeches. Despite his success, Hitler sustained a love-hate relationship with Berlin for the rest of his life.
He didn't like big cities. He rejected this way of life because he felt it was Jewish modernistic. However, he knew that ultimately the only way to power in Germany was by conquering the cities, and in particular by conquering the Reich's capital.
On the 30th of January 1933, Hitler left his abode in Berlin, the Hotel Kaiserhof, to take over the government. The restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, the world economic crisis and unemployment drove many voters to the Nazi Party. In order to make the world believe that Germany was a peace-loving country, the Nazis staged the 1936 Olympic Summer Games in Berlin. Hitler personally oversaw the designing of the Olympiastadion and the adjacent sports facilities.
Im Reichssportfeld wird für die Feier der 11. Olympiade eine einzigartige Kampfstätte geschaffen. Das Kernstück des weiten Reichssportfeldes ist das Olympiastadion, die Deutsche Kampfbahn. Um den Innenraum erheben sich Zuschauerplätze für mehr als 100.000 Personen. Unzählige Arbeiter sind Tag und Nacht am Werk. Auch sie schaffen in ihrer Art für die olympische Idee. Wie das ganze deutsche Volk bemüht ist, seinen Gästen einen würdigen Empfang zu bereiten.
Hitler
was involved in the choice of the stone to be used in the architectural plans almost from the beginning in 1934. He visited the construction site several times and directly intervened in many issues. In the presence of the French ambassador, André François Poncet, Hitler said that he didn't like the stadium. He thought it looked too modern.
Hitler war das noch zu modern.
Ich verkünde die Spiele von Berlin zur Feier der 11. Olympiade neuer Zeitrechnung als eröffnet.
From his seat in the VIP stand, the dictator was forced to watch as a black US athlete, of all people, became the favorite among the spectators, including the Germans. Jesse Owens beat Hitler's top Aryan athletes to win 4 gold medals. Nearly 4,000 athletes from 49 nations took part in the Games. Most male contestants were housed in the Olympic Village in Döberitz near Berlin. Today the complex stands empty. The area is fenced and the windows of the small houses are boarded up. Back in 1936, the Olympic Village was proudly presented in propaganda films. Foreign journalists were obviously impressed too.
The world would be a happier place,
wrote the correspondent of the British Observer,
if the youth of all nations could be brought together in this way more frequently.
The Second World War shattered this vision. After the end of the Games, the complex was used by the Wehrmacht until the Red Army occupied the area in 1945. Since the departure of the Soviet troops in 1992, the buildings have been empty, scarcely protected from the elements. Little remains of the time when the novel medium of television transmitted live from the Games and the Olympic Village.
Der aktuelle Bilddienst des Fernsehsenders Paul Nipkow lädt Sie heute ein zu einem Streifzug durch das olympische Dorf. Nun durch das Tor, vorbei am Pförtner und nun sind wir drin. Auf dem viel gelästerten märkischen Sand ist ein kleines Paradies entstanden. Die deutsche Wehrmacht hat es erbaut. Hier ein paar Aktive vor dem Hause Dessau. Wundervoll passen sich die Häuser der Landschaft an und sie sind auch herrlich, massiv und fest gebaut. Es muss ein wundervolles Wohnen sein. Und immer dabei ein Junge vom Olympischen Ehrendienst. Und hier ein amerikanisches Superschwergewicht.
Today, many of the buildings are very run down. So far, no one has thought of a way to put this extensive site to good use. The old indoor swimming pool, where in 1936 the athletes would prepare for their races, is partly burned out. For 2 weeks, Nazi Germany presented itself to the outside world as a peace-loving nation. The Games brought international acceptance for the Third Reich. Only a few far-sighted people realized the Nazis' true intentions. The Jewish novelist Victor Klemperer, for instance, wrote in his diary,
"It is continuously drummed into Germans as well as visitors that what one sees here is the upswing, the blossoming, the new spirit, the unity, the glory and the splendor, and naturally also the peaceful spirit of the Third Reich that affectionately embraces the whole world. The chants and the persecution of the Jews are all forbidden, and the offensive articles have disappeared from the newspapers for the duration of the Olympiad, until the 16th of August.
The less peace-loving face of the new Germany manifested itself at the huge Olympic Tower at the western end of the Reich sports field. It was here that a solemn commemorative service took place for the students who, in 1914, supposedly threw themselves into the machine gun fire of their enemies in Langemarck, Belgium, defying death, an ominous warning for what would happen here later in April 1945. Yet at first, after the end of the Olympic Games, the area was frequently used as a marching ground for National Socialist propaganda functions. It was mainly young people who were impressed by the mystic pomp of the Nazis. Television journalist Reinhard Appel took part in many mass marches in the presence of the dictator in the Olympic Park when he was a boy.
Being in the Hitler Youth,
we would often get orders to applaud or shout Heil at large-scale events. And I was one of those who was supposed to shout Heil. It was 1938, I remember, and there was a celebration for the Hitler Youth, and the whole Reich sports field was full of boys. Back then, I thought it was funny to start off a wave of hailing. Nowadays, you'd call it a Mexican wave. So I would start yelling, Heil, and was very pleased when the entire stadium would respond and follow suit, until I was noticed by a Hitler Youth leader and was thrown out for improper behavior.
Because the National Socialist Youth was to be systematically indoctrinated, the Hitler Youth homes erected all over the Third Reich were identical. A prototype can still be seen today in the northern outskirts of Berlin. It was designed in the style of a rural half-timbered house and presented at a propaganda show on Berlin's exhibition grounds. Later, it was transferred here to the Volkspark Rehberge. Physical fitness was paramount for National Socialist youths. Military training began at a very early age. The Hitler Youth homes served the purpose of controlling the boys' spare time. The date, 1936, can still be made out on the fireguard, and little else has changed in the festive hall of the former Hitler Youth home. Only the Nazi symbols were removed after the end of the war. Today, the home is used as a recreational facility for mentally handicapped children. During the Nazi regime, people like these would be categorized as unworthy to live and ruthlessly murdered. During the mid-1930s, administration buildings in the style of the New Era were erected all over Berlin. Air Minister Hermann Göring had an entire street front demolished at the Wilhelmstrasse in order to create a suitable official building for his ministry. Gradually, the entire government district was given the architectural features of the National Socialist spirit. In the west of Berlin, at Fährberliner Platz, a monumental complex of office buildings constructed during the Third Reich has survived to this day. The Rudolf Karstadt Corporation built its head office in Berlin right across from the Nordstern life insurance complex. It was decorated with National Socialist art, scenes from the working life of the community of the people. The total Führer state had become a reality and had found visible expression in the architecture. Hitler had very clear ideas about the redesigning of his capital. Berlin was to become the symbol of Germany's international standing. His plans covered over half of the urban area. In 1938, the Victory Column, the symbol of the capitulation of France in 1871, was relocated from its position in front of the Reichstag to the newly constructed east-west axis. This connecting route was built by Albert Speer, the Inspector General of Construction for the redesigning of the Reich's capital, and still dominates Berlin today. 5 road intersections form the so-called Great Star. The 10-lane main arterial road, planned for Hitler's triumphal processions, points exactly to the west. The east-west axis was inaugurated on the Führer's 50th birthday on the 20th of April 1939. In the years that followed, military parades were frequently held here. This footage shows the Legion Condor after its return from the Spanish Civil War. The street lamps on the east-west axis were designed by Albert Speer himself. They still flank part of the thoroughfare. Even beyond the government district, administrative buildings in the Reich's capital were also constructed in the architectural style of National Socialism. The tax office for the borough of Charlottenburg, for example, was moved into a representative monumental building in 1939. The eagle relief above the main entrance is still intact. Only the swastika was removed after 1945. Hitler boasted,
Others may live in the Kremlin or in a castle, but we will make sure that the buildings representing the Reich originate in our own time.
The most important project in Berlin between 1936 and 1938 was the expansion of the Reich Chancellery. Designed by Albert Speer, the overstated neoclassical architecture of Hitler's center of government stood for the power and the potency of National Socialist Germany. Its monumental dimensions were to dwarf the old buildings from the Kaiser era. Director Leni Riefenstahl and her camera were there when workers put the finishing touches on Hitler's new Chancellery of the Reich. On the 7th of January 1939, the architect personally showed his employer around the finished rooms. He had to construct the building within a year, Speer wrote later in his memoirs. But like many of these tales, this is pure fabrication. In reality, the architect had begun planning the Chancellery by the end of 1935. The Chancellery of the Reich was to serve primarily for representation. With its endless corridors, the dictator wanted to overwhelm foreign diplomats so that on the long way to the reception hall, they would get an idea of the true grandeur of the Third Reich. Original marble slabs from the long gallery of the Chancellery can be seen today in the Mohrenstrasse underground station in the middle of Berlin's government district. They were installed here after the end of the war. Most passengers are oblivious to the relics of the country's brown past. Nothing refers to their original use. Naturally, Albert Speer also designed the reception rooms and the Führer's study very grandiosely. This way, the dictator was able to achieve the desired effects at the New Year's reception for the diplomatic corps. The ruins of the Chancellery of the Reich were eradicated by the Soviet occupying power after the end of the war, and the last remnants of the Führer's bunker disposed of by GDR authorities in 1988. However, 2 years later, in 1990, a forgotten bunker used by the dictator's motor pool drivers was discovered accidentally. The bunker, built in 1940, comprises 8 small rooms. The rooms were used by the SS escort commandos of the Adolf Hitler bodyguard regiment. It seems that during the last days of the war, SS soldiers had barricaded themselves here.
This entire corner was full of stored ammunition. Infantry ammunition, hand grenades, bazookas, rifles, pistols. We therefore assumed that this room was the changing room and served as the arms depot at the same time.
In one of the rooms, amateurish attestations of National Socialist art were discovered. Enormous wall paintings glorifying the heroic service of SS soldiers. After the archaeological survey, the bunker was closed off again. "I want Berlin to be more beautiful than Paris ever was," Hitler apparently said after viewing the occupied capital of France. The megalomania of the dictator in designing the new Berlin knew no bounds. More and more new sketches and drafts were created on the drawing tables of the Inspector General of Construction for the Reich's capital. Hitler had been dreaming of gigantic edifices since his youth. Now, Albert Speer was designing them for him. The architect calculated annual costs of up to 500 million Reichsmarks. He had models made on a 1:50 scale and created a small imaginary city, which he proudly presented to his patron. The dictator hoped that everything would be finished within 20 years. Hitler's vision of the world capital, Germania, involved pulling down large parts of the city centre to make room for new, magnificent buildings. The inhabitants of the houses were resettled into dwellings that had belonged to deported Jews. However, the architect and his assistants were not sure whether the grand plans to build Germania were technically feasible. They were concerned that, after all, they might remain a vision. Would Berlin's underground be strong enough to bear the enormous loads of stone and concrete? The experts were asking themselves. To test this, they had an immense, odd-looking concrete cylinder built, which still stands today in the Tempelhof district. Due to its unusual shape, the locals have nicknamed it Pilz, the mushroom. Dietmar Arnold from the Berlin Underworlds Association is one of the experts in little-known relics from Berlin's National Socialist past. Arnold, a civil engineer, has also investigated the history of this unusual structure, which, up until a few years ago, was still used for soil mechanical experiments by the Technical University of Berlin.
This structure is a load-testing body built by French slave laborers in 1940 to 41 to establish whether the huge buildings planned for Germania could be erected on Berlin's soil. This was a stability test. When this giant was completed in 1941, its total weight was 12,600 tons. Engineers found it had subsided by 20 centimeters and slanted by 3.5 centimeters. But because of the immense load exerted here compared to a regular building, they thought this wouldn't present a problem, declaring Germania feasible, using this structure as proof.
A model made for Hitler demonstrated how the north-south axis, starting from the gigantic Südbahnhof station, would pass a 117-meter tall triumphal arch and end at the monstrous domed Volkshalle. Hitler had demanded that his capital match the magnitude of his mission. Speer's engineers had worked assiduously on a 3-meter tall model of the Great Hall.
The architectural design of Germania can be summarized in one word: exaggeration. The Great Hall, which was to be 290 meters high, is the most gigantic and also the best-known project of Hitler's plans for Germania.
aus dieser gesamten Planung Germania. Mit der damaligen Technik.
It would have been absolutely impossible to realize the hall with the technology of the time. If cost were no object, it would probably be possible to build it today. However, it would be impossible to predict how long it would stand, or whether it would survive a heavy spring or autumn storm.
Frühlings- oder Herbststurm widerstehen würde. Das kann man überhaupt nicht sagen.
The Great Hall, with a capacity of 120,000 people, was to be built out there, to the north of where we stand and south of the Lehrter Bahnhof. In front of it would be an enormous assembly square, 6 times the size of St. Peter's Square in Rome, bordered by enormous dominant edifices. The Reichstag would have been demoted to an auxiliary building. An important part of the designs was the traffic planning. 4 tunnel sections were already completed by 1940, but then construction work was suspended as not essential to the war effort. 3 tunnel sections are still intact, 2 road tunnels and a 220-meter-long subway tunnel, and can be visited. Actually, these tunnels are the last remnants of Germania that still exist in this area.
Somewhere in the Tiergarten is the carefully concealed entrance to one of the 2 road tunnels. The Senate administration of the capital aims to prevent unauthorized entry. The descent is dangerous, with the likelihood of poisonous gas being an added risk. At the moment, the air is clear. Dietmar Arnold can describe the construction on site.
We're now about 9 meters below the Tiergarten, in the western tunnel of the junction of the 2 axes. It's nearly 90 meters long, 14 wide and 4.8 meters high, and would have become an expressway tunnel. These are remnants of Germania. The junction of the axes was the point of intersection of the planned east-west and north-south axes. Only the east-west axis was completed to a large extent. Today it consists of the Straße des 17. Juni and Unter den Linden, while the north-south axis was never built. This is what remains today of these preposterous plans. This tunnel was rediscovered as late as 1967. As you can see here, the roof has been renovated. The authorities have calculated that it's cheaper to just leave them as they are.
Cars never drove through this tunnel. At some point during the war, a partition was evidently erected. Armament production is said to have been relocated here to escape the bomb hazard. All that remains of it now is a rusty lamp. At the other end, Dietmar Arnold has discovered evidence that the tunnel was also used by civilians as an air raid shelter during the Allied bombings.
This is the access staircase where people used to enter. What I think is particularly interesting is the extent of wear on the rungs. It shows that masses of people must have used them to get into the tunnel. In fact, this staircase could have been used by the civil air defense. The top was concreted over in the 1960s.
Im Befehlsstand der Luftverteidigung Berlin. Es wird ein Terrorangriff der britisch-amerikanischen Luftpiraten auf die Reichshauptstadt erwartet. Auf einer großen Leuchtkarte wird der Anflugweg der Feindmaschinen eingezeichnet. Der Feind hat die Stadtgrenze erreicht. Flak, Artillerie und Nachtjäger bereiten ihm einen heißen Empfang. Abschuss!
Newsreels have been calling on the people to put up fanatical resistance since the beginning of the Allied air raids. The propaganda films were made in the ministry of Joseph Goebbels, not far from the Chancellery. The Minister for Propaganda, a fanatic acolyte of Hitler's, had this representative official building constructed in the mid-1930s. From here, he exercised total control over public opinion in the Third Reich, leaving nothing to chance. Today, the federal government uses the monumental building as the Ministry for Labour and Social Affairs. In the same rooms where Vice-Chancellor Franz Müntefering confers with his assistants today, the Nazis were drafting their propaganda battles over 60 years ago. As the war progressed, Goebbels became a kind of home front dictator, trying to whitewash the bitter truth of the bomb war and appealing to the Germans to bear up. However, the minister had taken precautions regarding his own security. A bomb-proof private shelter was built beneath his official residence. The remainders of this bunker were discovered accidentally during construction work in 1998 and sealed up again shortly afterwards. Little is known about the setup of Goebbels' bunker. Apparently, the rooms were not luxuriously furnished, yet the minister could be permanently in touch with the outside world by means of a modern telephone system. His diaries reveal that, in the case of an air raid alarm, he would go either to his private shelter or to the underground command post at Wilhelmsplatz. On the 24th of November 1943, the minister wrote in his diary,
"The raid begins shortly after the alarm has sounded. This time they deploy more high explosive than incendiary bombs. This is another large-scale air raid. The fires are starting all around us, and the entire government district is hit by substantial bombs and mines. They devastate the area around Potsdamer Platz. The blast waves are so strong that even our bunker deep under the ground is rattling. The noise above us is hellish."
Later on, he continues,
"When I look around Wilhelmsplatz after the raid, the grim impressions of the night before are confirmed."
Within just a few days, 3,700 Berliners were killed and 450,000 became homeless. A few days later, in the Titania Palast, Goebbels gave one of his fanatical endurance speeches, culminating in the slogan, "The whole of Germany is crying for revenge." The Allied air raids made survival for the few Jews remaining in Berlin even more difficult. They could not seek safety in a shelter, so they had to look for new hiding places in the outskirts of the city if they wanted to avoid the dreaded catchers. Since 1941, over 50,000 of Berlin's Jews had been taken to the ghettos and concentration camps in the east. Few of them survived. During the so-called Fabrikaktion, or factory raids, at the end of February 1943, another 8,000 or more Jews working as slave laborers were displaced by the Gestapo. The old Jewish hospital in the Scheunenviertel, or Bahn district, had been used as a home for refugee children from Eastern Europe since the First World War. From 1941 to 1943, the Nazis misappropriated the building as an assembly camp for Berlin Jews before deporting them to the extermination camps. In most cases, the deportees weren't told the day they would leave the assembly camp.
Ich habe mir Geld verdient, indem ich Brötchen ausgetragen habe.
I was making some money by delivering rolls in the morning before school. One of the people I would deliver to was a Jewish physician in Spandau. I will never forget the distrustful, frightened eyes of his wife every time I rang the bell to let them know that the rolls were there. She was in constant fear of being arrested by the Nazis.
Weil sie sich ängstete, wer mag geklingelt haben und vielleicht sollten wir jetzt abgeholt werden.
The dictator made very few public appearances during the war, fearing he would become the target of an Allied precision attack, and he was rarely in Berlin. The longest he stayed in the Reich capital was 10 days in 1943. As a result, he had no first-hand experience of what his subjects were going through.
Adolf Hitler war im Herbst 1940.
Adolf Hitler was in Berlin in the autumn of 1940 during several relatively minor air raids. By chance, or what Adolf Hitler would have called premonition, he happened not to be in Berlin during any of the heavy raids from the beginning of 1941 to the autumn of 1944.
Luftangriff auf die Reichshauptstadt in Berlin gewesen.
Sometimes he would board his private train and leave Berlin just a few hours before a raid. Sometimes he didn't come to Berlin for several months. In any case, Hitler never visited any of the areas hit. He left that to his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels.
In February 1944, Goebbels wrote in his diary,
"The Führer has expressed very warm words for the composure of Berlin's population. He stresses that Berlin has truly become the Reich's capital during the air raids of the previous months. The bravery of Berlin's citizens demonstrated during the attacks was not thought possible in large parts of the German nation and in the entire world."
Still, Nazi leaders were looking into improved protection measures for the citizens from the bombs so as to keep up their resolve on the home front. More and more residential buildings were hit or destroyed in a firestorm by the Allied high-explosive or incendiary bombs. A result of these deliberations can be seen in a forest 100 kilometers north of Berlin. Odd-looking shelter constructions on the grounds of the former secret Luftwaffe test site in Rechtlin. The locals have named them White Houses. Documents of the time provide information concerning the purpose of the mysterious shelters. According to them, incendiary bombs were tested on these towers in July and August 1943. The documents refer to a Berlin borough, so these buildings may have been model houses for Hitler's capital, Germania, which were tested here to see just how bomb-proof they were. Were Berlin citizens to survive the bombing attacks in this way, in standardized houses with built-in shelter towers from reinforced concrete? There is no clear answer to this question. The results of the bombing tests on these prototypes are also unknown. By then, the sirens howled in Berlin almost daily. Sometimes, people had to spend entire days and nights in the air raid shelters. Latecomers were faced with locked doors. Going in and out of shelters became everyday routine for many Berliners, including the staff and patients of the city's hospitals. At the former Humboldt Hospital on Teichstrasse, one of these bomb-proof shelters is open to visitors. It was built in the vicinity of the main building in 1942 and served as an operation shelter, Type A. When the alarm sounded, the post-operative patients were taken from the hospital straight into the shelter through a subterranean passage over a ramp. Behind the protection of heavy iron gates and thick reinforced concrete, the doctors could even perform complicated surgical operations. Filter systems protected physicians, nurses, and patients from poisonous gases. Today, this relic from Hitler's Berlin is supervised by the Berlin Underworlds Association.
Patients had to be operated on during the bombing attacks too. However, the hospitals were not bomb-proof, and the Allied bombers, flying at an altitude of 7,000 or 8,000 meters, could not drop their payload accurately enough to spare the hospitals, which had red crosses painted on the roof. From March 1944 onwards, when the Americans started to bomb Berlin during the day, operations were always performed in the shelters. As far as the equipment was available, nearly all hospitals moved their operating rooms into the shelters simply for safety reasons. Altogether, we had 28 operation shelters in Berlin. Every major hospital had one or two. The fact that this one is so well preserved is actually just a historical coincidence. It was used for many years as a storage facility for the Senate, until our association took this shelter under our wing 1.5 years ago. Now we're gradually restoring it.
Fittings and surgical instruments from the time were collected from all around Germany in order to outfit the shelter as accurately in every detail as possible. After Joseph Goebbels' declaration of total war, his propaganda machinery kept inventing new rallying calls. "Our walls are broken, but not our hearts," was one of the cynical slogans. Others included, "The warring city of Berlin greets the Führer," and "Führer command, we will obey." Despite the precautions the Nazis had taken, Berlin city centre was also heavily hit by bombs several times. On Hitler's orders, 3 enormous anti-aircraft towers had been hurriedly erected for the protection of the government district. The remains of one of these flak towers can still be found today at Humboldthain, north of the city centre. The reinforced concrete giant was only partly destroyed when the victors tried to demolish it. A few years ago, the Berlin Underworlds Association was granted permission to open the existing entrances and explore the tower's interior. Tons of rubble were removed from the ruin before a first inspection of the bizarre bunker system became possible. Gradually, elevator shafts and former ammunition depots were revealed. It was sometimes a risky business for the researchers. Today, parts of the gigantic structure are accessible. The structure was shaken by the blasting attempts of the Allies after the war. The ceiling sagged visibly. Whether or not they will cave in one day is unclear. When put into service in 1942, the Flak Tower was classified as indestructible, and this is obviously still true today, if only partly. A network of corridors and staircases extend as deep as 8 stories below the ground.
Maybe we should put up a proper fence here, down there at the back. This is as far as it goes. We're now in the so-called turret 3 of the Humboldthain Flak Tower, an anti-aircraft tower which consisted of 4 gun turrets. Facing us here are the main elevator shaft and the main spiral staircase. The elevator shaft went from the ground floor to the 4th floor. The stairs went another floor up to the 5th floor. The stairwell was actually only used by the garrison until 1943, when the civilian population was permitted to use it for seating because there weren't enough bunker facilities in Berlin. What you can see here are the effects of the blastings. The entire stairwell has caved in, except for the area between the 5th and the 4th floor, and there are huge chunks of reinforced concrete still hanging from the walls. So it's extremely dangerous to venture down there, because in some parts, these chunks, which weigh tons, could come loose at any time, something you definitely want to avoid. Here you can see very clearly the damage caused by the blasting in '48 by the French occupying power. We're in the French sector here. As we know, Germany was to be demilitarized and bunkers were considered military structures. The French detonated 3 charges in total. The first had no effect whatsoever. The second destroyed only parts of the bunker, and only after the 3rd charge did the rear end cave in. It collapsed like a house of cards. By the way, the Soviets and the Brits had the same problems with the flak towers in their sectors. They were difficult to demolish because of the vast amounts of concrete used.
The huge concrete towers offered protection for up to 30,000 people, but also for valuable museum pieces during the Allied air raids. Even some armament production was relocated here. In the end, their heavy anti-aircraft guns were not enough to prevent the fall of Berlin. Demolishing the ruins would be far too expensive, so this relic from the Second World War will continue to be used by the bunker experts in future for research and expeditions.
Großstadtverkehr Juli 1943 in der Reichshauptstadt am Alexanderplatz. Straßenbahnen, Lastkraftwagen mit Lebensmitteln und sonstiger kriegswichtiger Ladung und ringsherum die Hochhäuser und Büros, in denen Männer und Frauen für den Sieg arbeiten.
Air raid shelter systems were built all around Berlin, including beneath the Alexanderplatz. A television film of the time about market gardening in the city centre unintentionally shows the ventilation shafts of the subterranean bunker system. Stretching over 2 stories, the Alexanderplatz bunker was the largest underground shelter in the city. According to a special plan, all mainline railway stations in Berlin were outfitted with such shelter systems during the war, with the aim of putting up travellers in the case of a bombing attack. Later in the war, residents of the area and passers-by were also allowed to use the extensive shelter.
During the final stages of the war, we had to go into the air raid shelter almost every day. By then, the war had arrived in Berlin with the bombing attacks. I remember spending many nights in the shelter. I also remember that during an event organized by the Hitler Youth, we had to go into a shelter. But because I didn't want to, I ran away and walked along the Heerstraße towards home, while the air raid was in full swing. I could see the bombers dropping their load, but I wasn't scared. I walked for over an hour from Unter den Linden all the way to Spandau, and somehow I got home unharmed.
In his function as commissary for the total war effort, Joseph Goebbels assembled Volkssturm or Home Guard divisions in late 1944 and had them march in front of the Brandenburg Gate for propaganda purposes.
Der Tag des Volkssturms ist ein kraftvoller Beweis dafür, dass kein Feindterror das deutsche Volk beugen kann und dass die Herzen seiner Menschen über Masse, Material und Hass triumphieren werden.
The elderly, members of the Hitler Youth, semi-invalids and even women were trained to use anti-tank rocket launchers with the intention of stopping the advancing Red Army. At the beginning of February 1945, Goebbels declared Berlin a fortress. Adolf Hitler had his final appearance on the newsreel of the 20th of March. The Führer decorated Hitler Youth boys who had fought Soviet units with their bazookas. Shortly before the end, even the last underage reserves were mobilized and mercilessly annihilated in street fighting. The Olympic Tower was also converted into a stronghold of fanatic Nazi no-surrender terror. Here too, child soldiers were deployed in an attempt to halt the Soviet advance into the city center. All of those unwilling to participate in this senseless suicide mission were publicly shot.
The Volkssturm men and Hitler Youth boys, who were the last contingent, had barricaded themselves in at several locations with orders to defend the government district. One of these places was the Reich sports field. At the end of April 1945, at least 3, maybe even 4,000 Hitler Youth boys confronted the far superior Red Army. How many of them died remains uncertain. I didn't want the Russians to capture Berlin, so I wanted to defend the city at any cost. Better dead than a slave was one of the slogans they had hammered into us. Self-sacrifice is an heroic deed. I honestly admit that I was quite prepared to sacrifice myself because this was how I was brought up, to defend the fatherland by all means, even accepting death.
Das Vaterland zu verteidigen, dass ich auch den Tod in Kauf genommen hätte.
The Führer didn't care about the senseless sacrifice of the Hitler Youth Boys and his soldiers. He didn't leave his last bastion alive. On the 6th of May 1945, the defenders were forced to leave the Chancellery of the Reich through the open gates of the subterranean bunkers before a running camera. This appearance of Hitler's last disciples was staged by the Soviets for the newsreel at home. The curious victors wandered across the heavily damaged seat of government of the dictator. Hitler's charred body was found buried in the garden, not far from the remains of his designated successor. Josef and Magda Goebbels had poisoned their 6 children shortly before the capitulation and then committed suicide. The history of National Socialist Berlin was over. Tanks that had participated in the capture of Berlin flanked the Soviet monument at the Reichstag, which the victors erected at the end of 1945 in memory of those fallen in the Great Patriotic War. For many decades, it was suggested that stones from Hitler's new chancellery were used in its construction to symbolize the victory over National Socialism. But this is probably just a propagandistic legend that helped to seal the fall of Hitler's Berlin. During the Nazi years, Munich was given the honorary title Capital of the Movement. After the fall of the Third Reich, however, its citizens wanted to do away with the city's fascist past, and Munich suppressed its National Socialist history. Yet remnants of the time are still omnipresent in Bavaria's capital, shaping the cityscape to this day. The Nazis inaugurated the new buildings with huge celebrations, perfectly staged for maximum propaganda effect. On the Day of German Art in 1937, for instance, all the Nazi notables were assembled in Munich. On some house fronts, the symbols of the Wehrmacht and the Nazi Party are visible to this day. Not all of them were removed at the end of the war. The remains of the so-called Brauner's house, however, were filled in 60 years ago and only recently excavated. Hitler had great plans for Munich. The entire city centre was to be redesigned. An original model illustrating the mammoth project to survive the war undamaged. A boulevard was to lead to the newly constructed railway station. Its enormous dome would have towered above all other buildings in the area. Hitler, who had always dreamt of being an architect, paid regular visits to the construction site, carefully scrutinizing the ongoing work. Today, hardly a trace remains of the fact that the Königsplatz was one of the centers of the National Socialist movement. After remodeling the square, the Nazis used it for their marches. In addition, Königsplatz was also the stage for an annual propaganda event honoring the early martyrs of the party, a pseudo-religious cult of the dead.
National Socialism started out in this city. This is where the German Workers' Party, the forerunner of the NSDAP, was founded in 1919. This is where the SA, the SS and the Hitler Youth were formed. This is where the Reich headquarters of the NSDAP were located. This is where Adolf Hitler rose from being an insignificant army informer to the leader of the most powerful party in Germany.
After the end of the First World War, Munich's pubs were used by all political parties as venues for their meetings. In 1919, the army sent Adolf Hitler to spy on a meeting of the German Workers' Party in the Sterneckerbräu brewery. But instead of passing information to his superiors, Hitler himself joined the party, which changed its name to NSDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, early in 1920, and took over its leadership within a few months. The fact that the patrons in Munich's breweries were usually intoxicated made it easy to stir up emotions. Even back then, the Hofbräuhaus was one of the most popular beer halls. The Nazis were quick to realize that the atmosphere here ideally suited their purposes. So along with the Sterneckerbräu brewery and the Bürgerbräu and Löwenbräu cellars, the Hofbräuhaus was one of the first centers of the National Socialist movement.
Munich was a very fertile breeding ground for the National Socialist ideas, which were mainly nationalism, racism and anti-Semitism. These ideas of an initially small extremist right-wing group were very well received here. It all originated in the beer cellars, where heated speeches fueled up resentment after the lost war.
Political meetings had been held in the Great Ballroom since the beginning of the 20th century. The hall was largely destroyed by Allied air raids at the end of the Second World War and was rebuilt in 1950. Hitler, too, used the charged atmosphere in the beer halls as a stage for his preposterous and grotesque rantings. In 1937, on the occasion of the Nazi Party's 14th anniversary, he gave a speech on the birth of the Nazi movement in the ballroom of the Hofbräuhaus.
Ich weiß, dass damals viele die Aussichtslosigkeit dieser Bewegung beurteilten nach dem Maß ihrer damaligen Größe und dem Maß der Größe der Aufgaben, die gestellt waren. Wollen wir denn in dieser Stunde wieder unseren alten Schlachtruf ausstoßen? Unsere nationalsozialistische Partei, unser deutsches Volk und unser deutsches Reich dienen Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil!
Hitler was determined to take up the fight against the hated Weimar Republic. Together with General Ludendorff, a prominent World War veteran, and several thousand supporters, he attempted a revolt on the 9th of November 1923. Their march was stopped at the Feldherrenhalle. 4 policemen and 16 putschists died in the shootout. The putsch leaders were arrested. After seizing power in 1933, the Nazi leaders held a commemorative ceremony here every year for the early martyrs of the movement. The 9th of November was declared a national holiday, and the Odeonsplatz Square became one of the central places commemorating the bloodshed and the martyrs. The Nazis put up a plaque with the names of all the victims outside the Feldherrenhalle, which passers-by had to salute in honor of the dead. The shrine was removed by the Americans in 1945. Since 1994, a memorial slab on the ground honors the memory of the 4 policemen killed in that gunfight. Only 3 months after the failed putsch, its initiators, Adolf Hitler, Erich Ludendorff, and another 8 National Socialists, were tried for high treason. Due to the enormous interest of the public and among the press, the trial was held in the military school for safety reasons. The verdict was lenient. Hitler had supporters in the judiciary system and the police.
Munich politicians, as well as the police, strongly inclined to the right. There were close ties between the NSDAP and many senior police officials, and these people more or less facilitated the rise of the party. The local press also helped to spread Nazi literature. It was a collaboration which really only existed here in Munich.
Das war eine Konstellation, wie es sie eben nur in München gab.
At the end of 1924, after only 10 months, Hitler was released from the fortress where he was being held. During his time in prison, he dictated the script for Mein Kampf to his later deputy, Rudolf Hess. On his return to Munich, Hitler sought to consolidate the party's position. In 1925, the re-established NSDAP opened its offices on the premises of the Völkische Beobachter newspaper in the Lehel district. Within 2 years, the number of members had trebled. By 1928, over 100,000 names were listed in the National Socialist Party's records. These pictures from the head office show a young Heinrich Himmler as an eager assistant. Soon he will become one of the most unscrupulous henchmen of the Nazi regime and the man responsible for the death of millions. Soon afterward, the party headquarters were moved to the district of Schwabing. When the number of members trebled again in 1930 compared to the previous year, Hitler started to look for an imposing building, quote, befitting the importance and the calling of the NSDAP. Palais Barlow, a classical building near Königsplatz, was found. In January 1931, Hitler and his 56 assistants moved into the stately property, which from then on was popularly known as Brauner's House. In the summer of 2006, a team of experts worked here for 6 months to uncover the foundations of the former Nazi Party headquarters, of which only the cellar walls remain intact. Munich's new documentation center for the National Socialist era will be constructed on this historically significant site in 2008. But before the remainders of the past are eliminated, the ruins of the Brauner's House are to be archaeologically surveyed and evaluated in detail.
It was clear to all of us involved that one could not just commence with the structural planning here. Before that, we would have to examine what used to be the basement and see what we could find, mainly for 2 reasons. Firstly, to see if we could make any discoveries which might be used in the later documentation. We now know this is clearly not the case. Or, and that would have been the negative scenario, if we found something that might prevent the concept, which would have forced us to rethink the whole plan.
Oder ob man, das wäre sozusagen der negative Fall gewesen, hier in Anführungszeichen Entdeckungen machen würde, die dem Konzept im Wege stünden und man dann von neu nachdenken müsste.
But this was not the case either. Things have been relatively unspectacular since we began here in August. We've discovered a maze of walls that look exciting, but nothing of extraordinary contemporary historical significance.
Aber das ist nur nichts von herausragender zeitgeschichtlicher Bedeutung.
That was the initial opinion of the experts involved in the project, until they discovered aluminium stencils with set-in copies for party documents. This proved that the cellar had contained the records office of the Nazi Party, which was believed to be lost. When American troops occupied Munich in May 1945, they found that the Palais Barlow had been razed to the ground by 2 direct hits of Allied bombers. The ruins were looted by Munich citizens and GIs. Anything of use was taken away. Soon afterward, the site was leveled. It was only 60 years later that the Regional Office for the Preservation of Historic Monuments decided to unearth the ruins. Moritz Tannebauer is the on-site director of this uncovering project.
This is the cellar of the Brauner's house. Of course, the area looked totally different when we started out. It was covered by a nice lawn, and we had no idea what to expect. We started excavating and uncovered all the walls, then the individual rooms. Where we are now, for instance, was the kitchen area. Over there, one of our people is making a sketch of the walls. The walls have been cleaned, of course, to show up every detail. The kitchen here had direct access to the dining area, which consisted of several rooms, one behind the other, with wooden floors and paneling on the walls. We take photographs, draw, survey and analyze, just like we would do in any archaeological excavation. Now we're in the boiler room. The big boiler which was here was used until the building was connected to the main heating system during the construction of the so-called Führer. From here, we enter the machinery room, which is not part of the old Palais Barlow. That's obvious from the thickness of the walls. Here they created a passageway to this extension, which was built in 1931 and was mainly used for technical installations, such as a pump station for sewage. This was the foundation for the pumps they used to dispose of waste.
Wo da eben das Schmutzwasser wieder herausgenommen werden konnte aus dem Haus.
Despite the new discoveries, the authorities are sticking to their plans to remove the remains of the Nazi past in 2007. A possible incorporation of the existing cellars into the new building for the Nazi Documentation Center is not favored. The final decision on the design will be made in 1 year, after an invitation to tender. But by then, the historically important cellar structures will have long disappeared. Adolf Hitler's private dwelling was on the other side of the River Isar. He lived in a 400-square-meter apartment on the fashionable Prinzregentenplatz, where he had moved in 1929. Wealthy supporters paid the rent for this luxurious apartment. Today, the building houses a police station. Chief Inspector Dieter Vögele has been researching the history of the house for many years.
These are the rooms of Hitler's apartment. It occupied a total area of 397.5 square meters. This is the hallway. That room was part of the dining room. This was the living room. And here was the guest room where Geli Raubal lived.
Hitler's niece took her own life under mysterious circumstances in her uncle's apartment in 1931. Apparently, Hitler never got over her suicide. After her death, no one except himself was allowed to enter her room. Today, it serves as a storage room.
The bathroom is through there. It was accessible from both rooms. And this was his Spartan bedroom, with just a bed, a table, and a small cupboard. This was part of the living room. We're using it as a computer training room today. And this is the vintage library from the time of the United Workshops in Munich. It was crammed with books because Hitler was a very well-read man. Now we use it to display the cups we've won at police football championships.
Für die sportlichen Erfolge, die wir erzielt haben in puncto Fußball.
And this is the exact spot where the couch stood on which Geli Raubal was found dead in September 1931.
The original air raid shelter can still be found in the cellar. Hitler had ordered it to be built for himself and the other residents. As of 1938, he owned the entire building. In accordance with the regulations, this private shelter was approved by the local building control office just after the beginning of the war in November 1939. The panelled room in the centre of the underground shelter was obviously reserved for the dictator. However, Hitler never used this bunker. After the war began, he spent very little time in his Munich home. After the accession to power in 1933, the Nazis systematically began to eliminate the remaining democratic elements all across the Reich. Stormtrooper marches became part of the daily routine in Munich's streets too. The elected Bavarian government capitulated without resistance on the 9th of March. Now opponents of the new regime were mercilessly persecuted and sent to the nearby concentration camp in Dachau. This footage shows the arrival of the newly elected Reich Chancellor at Munich's Riem airport. From now on, Hitler mainly stayed in the Reich's capital. His visits to Munich became less and less frequent.
The political power of the National Socialists was gradually transferred to Berlin, and then after 1933, Berlin became the center of political power. But Adolf Hitler had explicitly decreed that Munich, which was given the honorary title Capital of the Movement in 1935, should remain the seat of the NSDAP national headquarters.
Sitz der Reichsleitung der NSDAP bleiben solle.
This is the reason why certain institutions from all the party's administrative departments had their offices here, in the area between Königsplatz and Karolinenplatz.
The Nazis had been using the area around Königsplatz for their marches since the early days. On Hitler's decree, the site was to be converted to a forum of the movement. Paul Ludwig Trost, one of the Führer's preferred architects, had the square tiled with granite slabs especially for their marches, in order to amplify the noise produced by the parading formations. It was the first major construction project of the new government, and Hitler frequently inspected its progress. Rare footage from the personal archives of Albert Speer shows him probably in the autumn of 1935. The dictator was interested in every detail. After the Königsplatz, he went on to examine the two so-called blood temples at the front of the square and afterwards the shell of the Führerbau. His plan was to have a complex built covering the entire area between Karolinenplatz and Königsplatz to accommodate the party headquarters. The Führerbau was erected next to the identically constructed NSDAP administration building on the eastern side of Königsplatz. The imposing building was intended to be used for receptions and state ceremonies and was accordingly pompously furnished. Nazi propaganda claimed that some of Hitler's own ideas had been incorporated in the plans. However, he didn't show up here often. As of 1957, the building was used by the College for Theatre and Music. The Munich Agreement was signed on the 29th of September 1938, here in Hitler's former study. In the previous months, Nazi propaganda had been reporting on alleged ill treatment of the Sudeten German minority in Czechoslovakia. With this treaty, the European powers agreed to the German Reich's annexation of Sudetenland, in the hope of preventing a war. A year later, the German Wehrmacht invaded Poland. The underground tunnel system beneath the Führerbau has also survived.
This is one of the underground connecting passages. The entire party headquarters was subterraneously connected. This is the tunnel that led to the Brauner's house. Over there is a longer tunnel that went beneath Brienner Straße, ending at the NSDAP administration building. On the walls, you can still see all the graffiti the Americans left behind.
American GIs scrawled their initials on the walls in 1945. Over 60 years later, these inscriptions indicate the stations of their deployment during the war.
These were the storerooms of the Führerbau. As the compound mainly served representational purposes, receptions and banquets and so on, they needed large storage facilities for supplies. This was the beer cellar, and over there was the red wine cellar. After the war, the Americans wrote, "Keep out, Germans and co." This was the potato cellar, which was looted by the locals before the Americans arrived. The guards had already left by then. Before the Americans came, people forced open this door. The bullet holes are still visible.
The plan was to build a new party chancellery for the NSDAP leadership, the counterpart to the Reich Chancellor in Berlin, right next to the Führerbau. Construction for the monstrous administration building commenced in 1938. Atelier Trost, a Munich-based firm of architects, had done the design work. But construction was suspended at the beginning of the Second World War, so the chancellery was never built. The only parts that had been completed were the enormous underground bunkers. Originally, all air raid protection facilities in the party district were connected, so that all the buildings would remain accessible in case of emergency. These shelters were intended to be used exclusively by Nazi functionaries. Only when the Allied bombing attacks on Munich intensified was the party bunker opened to the civilian population. The building that houses the Institute of the city's Technical University was erected on top of the bunker in 1970. In the course of 2007, the underground tunnel system will have to make room for a new building of the College for Television and Film. In 1937, 4 years after the foundation stone was laid, the House of German Arts, another Nazi edifice in Munich, was ceremoniously inaugurated with a procession. From now on, the Day of German Art was to be celebrated here every year. But the war put a stop to these plans. There were only 3 processions in all. When exhibitions opened in the House of German Arts, they were frequently staged as pompous propaganda spectacles. The museum is one of the few representational buildings of the Nazi regime which were actually built in Munich. These celebrations always attracted many Nazi notables to Munich. Adolf Hitler himself attended the Great Exhibition of German Art. In 1939, he was given a guided tour of the exhibition rooms by Gerdi Trost, the widow of the architect. Art that conformed to his regime was to the Führer's taste. Until 1944, the presentation of what the Nazis considered to be art took place annually.
Das festliche Haus der deutschen Kunst birgt auch im 4. Kriegsjahr die Schöpfungen führender deutscher Maler und Bildhauer. Das ganze Volk nimmt mit offenem Herzen Anteil am Kunstschaffen der Gegenwart. Wir erleben das Antlitz deutscher Männer und Frauen. Die gestraffte Figur eines Arbeiters. Neue Quellen des künstlerischen Schaffens erschließt der Krieg. Es ergreifen uns zutiefst der beherrschte Schmerz im Gesicht des Verwundeten und die vom eben beendeten Kampf noch aufgewühlten Züge des Soldatenhauptes.
Hitler had been directly involved in the planning for this building too. He even laid down the exact site where it was to be built. At the inauguration, he described the stone-clad museum as the first beautiful building of the new Reich. Art is a sublime mission, and an obligation to fanaticism, added the dictator. After the war, a section of the undamaged building was used as an officers' mess by the Americans until 1955. The rest of the building remained a museum. At the same place as the Nazis had staged their notorious show of so-called degenerate art in 1937, visitors could now view works of art that had been banned during the Thousand-Year Reich. The Haus der Kunst is still used for exhibitions of all kinds today.
Der Führer besichtigte mit dem italienischen Minister Landini die neu eröffnete Architektur- und Kunsthandwerksausstellung in München. Die Ausstellung bringt einen Rechenschaftsbericht über die neuen großen Bauten in Deutschland.
In Munich, too, Hitler let his architectural megalomania run wild. The buildings he commissioned for the capital of the movement exceeded all reasonable dimensions. The original model for the restructuring of Munich into the Führer's city has survived the war undamaged. It is exhibited in Munich's Municipal Museum. The planning did not just entail individual buildings. The whole city was to be redesigned. The new face of Munich would symbolically present the city's role as the birthplace of National Socialism.
Geplant war nun,
They were planning to erect a grand forum at the end of each Autobahn dedicated to the so-called pillars of the party, the SA, the SS, and the Hitler Youth. So the pillars of the party would literally support the capital of the movement. Starting from these forums, they were going to build wide access roads to the places of historical significance for the party. For example, one would be able to drive directly from a forum to the Bürgerbräu-Keller.
Hitler entrusted the implementation of his vision to architect Hermann Giesler. Jochen Wilk was one of the people working in the architect's office at that time.
Giesler was quite close to the Führer, who would frequently summon him for progress reports. Hitler approved of more or less everything that Giesler presented to him, but occasionally there were issues about which Hitler had made up his mind and wouldn't budge, and Giesler had to accept that without question.
The most hideous plans were those for the new central railway station. The original model is currently being restored by experts in Munich's Municipal Museum. It hasn't been on display for many years because of its poor state of preservation. Christian Hale's team is now putting the remaining parts of the model together. The old terminus station was to be replaced by a new gigantic through station further west, featuring a huge dome construction.
The dome was supposed to cover 20 double tracks, which means the dimensions would have been huge. The first plans provided for a diameter of 245 meters, but it soon became clear that this wouldn't be enough, so it was increased to 265. Based on this figure, a complete plan was then drawn up for the whole station, including static calculations and so on.
Whether the huge dome would have been feasible is highly doubtful. Starting from the new station, a new east-west axis, the so-called Prachtstraße, or Glorious Boulevard, would then lead into the city centre.
Essentially, all this would have been just enormous blocks, relatively undifferentiated. All they were planning to do was line up facades. The functionality of these constructions didn't interest anyone at first, or even at this stage of planning.
The plan was to erect an oversized column of the party at the end of this road, on the site of the old terminus station. Just like the new station's dome, this column is another indication of Hitler's megalomaniac fantasies.
Die Säule ist also keine Erfindung von Giesler.
The column was not Giesler's creation. The original design was Speer's. Giesler revised the column several times because he found it too tall and too chunky at the base. But basically, none of us working in Giesler's office were keen on that column. It was never a popular project, the column of the party. Its design was wrong from an urban planning aspect. It was much too big, and it would have ended up being even taller than the towers of the Frauenkirche.
The Nazis planned to display the so-called Blutfahne, or blood flag, from Hitler's 1923 putsch in the base of the column. Just as in other cities of the Reich, the first victims of this urban restructuring were the Jewish citizens. On the 9th of June 1938, 5 months before the Night of Broken Glass, the main Munich synagogue was demolished upon Adolf Hitler's personal orders. The Jewish community was charged with the demolition costs of the building. The authorities claimed traffic-related problems to justify the demolition. In reality, the discrimination of Jewish citizens was well advanced by then. The Aryanization of Jewish companies and businesses had already begun in 1933. For years, Andreas Häusler from Munich City Archives has been investigating the erosion of Jewish citizens' rights in the Bavarian capital. The Jewish community in Munich was quite large. 1,700 Jewish businesses were still registered in the city at the beginning of 1938.
Jewish economic activity was evident in every part of the city. However, one can trace the gradual disappearance of these businesses. I believe it had a lot to do with Munich's reputation as the birthplace of the National Socialist movement. People here were particularly compliant and dedicated when carrying out the wishes of the Nazi leaders.
The city archives contain tens of thousands of files on cases of Aryanization. Nazi bureaucracy meticulously recorded every process and every document. Many citizens shamelessly used the plight of their Jewish neighbors to enrich themselves.
One could say that banishing the Jews from economic life triggered off a kind of gold digger mentality among the population. The Jews were losing their entire possessions, and the other citizens used the opportunity to get hold of these objects at auctions or otherwise.
Bürger sich bei Versteigerungen oder sonstigen Gelegenheiten diese Objekte an Land zu ziehen. Ein besonders interessanter Fall ist das Unternehmen von Heinrich Cohen.
One of the most interesting cases is Heinrich Cohen. He owned a very well-known textile store in Munich, a long-established and financially sound business. After 1933, his business naturally tempted so-called Aryanizers.
1933 dann auch die Begehrlichkeiten von sogenannten Aryseuren geweckt.
The person who finally acquired this business was an employee of WWII, a large clothing manufacturer. Because he didn't have enough capital, he was helped by the WWII management and managed to buy Heinrich Cohen's business at a very favorable price.
Natürlich zu einem sehr günstigen Preis. Nach 1945.
After 1945, no one was particularly interested in the pre-war history of the company. The new owner, a certain Speer, was never questioned on how he had acquired the business or his wealth. On the contrary, he rose to a kind of jet-setter and became part of Munich's in-crowd.
Der sich immer sehr gerne in der schicken Münchner Society bewegt hat.
Munich was not only the city of the party, it was also the city of resistance against the regime. It was here that students of the White Rose Group distributed their leaflets, and carpenter Georg Elser almost succeeded in his assassination attempt on Hitler. On the evening of the 8th of November 1938, a homemade bomb exploded in the Bürgerbräu Keller. For over a month, Elser had been hollowing out a pillar in the hall where Hitler gave his annual memorial speech and stashed the bomb inside.
Ab
Attentat auf die traditionelle Führerkundgebung im historischen Bürgerbräukeller. Der Führer hatte die Versammlungsstätte kurze Zeit vor der Katastrophe verlassen. Wäre die Kundgebung wie üblich verlaufen, so hätte der Mordplan sein Ziel erreicht. Die Stelle, an der der Führer bei seiner Rede stand, war nach dem Anschlag mit einem 3 Meter hohen Trümmerhaufen bedeckt. 8 Tote und 63 Verletzte forderte dieses gemeine Verbrechen.
Hitler had left the hall much earlier than planned and was on his private train to Berlin when the device went off. The Nazis immediately accused the British of plotting the assassination attempt, and in order to feed the propaganda machinery, 2 British spies were arrested on the following day. The actual perpetrator was already in custody at the time. The border police had arrested him while trying to flee to Switzerland. His ambitious motive had been to liberate Germany from the tyrants. Georg Elser died in the Dachau concentration camp in 1945. The victims of the bomb attack were laid out in front of the Feldherrenhalle. Again, the historically charged location at Odeonsplatz served as a backdrop for a celebration of the Nazi cult of the dead. National Socialist propaganda stylized the bomb victims to heroes and martyrs.
Die Opfer des gemeinen Bombenanschlages wurden vor der Feldherrnhalle aufgebahrt. Tag und Nacht defilierte hier die Münchner Bevölkerung in ergriffener Trauer vorbei, um die Toten noch einmal zu grüßen.
Hitler attributed his luck to an act of providence. The pseudo-religious dimension of his regime's rule was now consolidated once and for all. Even prior to this attempt, the dictator had often claimed that fate had chosen him for this task.
Der Führer erwies seinen getreuen Kämpfern die letzte Ehre. Der Stellvertreter des Führers hielt die Traueransprache, in der er von den Opfern dieses grauenhaften Verbrechens Abschied nahm. Ein Wunder habe den Führer vor dem Tode bewahrt, den ruchlose Mörderhand ihm bestimmt hatte. Die Vorsehung, die uns den Führer gesandt hat, werde ihn uns auch für die Zukunft bewahren.
Critical journalist Ruth Andreas Friedrich wrote in her diary during that time, "For Hitler's opponents, it has been clear since 1933 that the 1,000-year Reich will go to war sooner or later, a war which Germany is bound to lose. We have had 6 years to get used to this idea, but now an end with terror almost seems more bearable than terror without an end." Housing developments were built on the outskirts of Munich for the ordinary folk. This model development in Rammersdorf was based on plans drawn up during the Weimar Republic, which the Nazis then simply adopted. In case of war, the gardens would help the residents to become self-sufficient. The settlement plans for Munich were abandoned in 1935. One of the reasons was the high cost. Also, the Nazis considered such housing projects bourgeois and traditionalist. The Nazis erected entire towns consisting of such developments all over the Reich as part of a gigantic construction project. A propaganda film of the German Labour Front was to make life in a settlement more attractive to the comrades.
Viele Arbeitskameraden haben den Wunsch nach einer eigenen Heimstätte. Diese Heimstättensiedlungen werden vom Reichsheimstättenamt der Deutschen Arbeitsfront entwickelt. Das Reichsheimstättenamt führt sowohl die Planung des Hauses als auch die wirtschaftliche Planung des Gartens durch. Zweckmäßig und schön ist die Einteilung der Wohnräume. Ebenso zweckmäßig und schön die Einrichtungsgegenstände, die vom Reichsheimstättenamt entworfen und mit geringen Mitteln zu beschaffen sind. Heimat auf eigenem Boden. Unser Siedlerpaar sieht sich und seine Familie schon in Gedanken in dieser bis ins Kleinste vom Reichsheimstättenamt wohnlich und behaglich entworfenen Heimstätte.
At Munich's Prinzregentenstraße, an enormous experimental construction project for the residents of the so-called Südstadt or South Town has survived. These satellite towns were planned as independent subsystems within the city. The uniform apartment blocks were given names such as Wallgau, Inn or Alpenland, suggesting coziness in a national community context. The most characteristic feature of these apartment blocks are the above-ground bomb shelters on the corners of the buildings, of which 2 still exist.
This is where the Aryans were supposed to live after the victory, in relatively large, luxurious apartments. These apartment blocks were to be supplemented by huge shelters on the corner of each building, so that residents would have direct access to their designated bunker. The aim here, of course, was to coax the population into accepting a permanent state of mobility for war, even when they were in their homes.
The steel doors of one of the shelters still exist today. Each of these structures would offer protection to 200 people. The access doors from the apartments were walled up after the war. Today, the bunker is used as a storeroom. As of September 1939, the Third Reich was at war. The Nazi regime was quick to organize an entertainment program at home for war invalids and soldiers on leave. In Munich, the diversion of tea and dancing at the Seehaus in the English Garden helped Wehrmacht soldiers to take their minds off the horrors of war. When Nazi Germany began to rearm, Munich became an important center for the arms industry. One of the buildings grimly manifesting the increased armament of the Luftwaffe was the headquarters of Air Region Command 4 on Prinzregentenstraße. Today, the building houses Bavaria's Ministry of Economic Affairs. Not all of the relics of the Nazi past were removed after the war. Wehrmacht helmets still crown the window gables, and on a side street you can still see wrought iron railings decorated with swastikas. Although the war was clearly lost by the end of 1943, the Wehrmacht demonstrated its firm belief in final victory during a parade on Munich's Ludwigstraße. The 9th of November, 1943, Hitler was making his annual speech in the Bürgerbräu Keller in memory of the failed Nazi putsch.
In seiner Rede rechnet Adolf Hitler mit den Feinden Deutschlands ab. Deutsches Volk sei völlig beruhigt. Was auch kommen mag, wir werden es meistern. Am Ende steht der Sieg.
It was one of the dictator's last appearances in Munich. As the armaments production in the Third Reich was close to collapse, the Dachau concentration camp near the city was given a new function. The camp had been built for 5,000 political prisoners in March 1933. Himmler had personally chosen the site of a former munitions factory. The party newspaper, Völkischer Beobachter, reported,
"In this camp, all the communist functionaries will be concentrated, and, as far as necessary, members of the Social Democratic militia who endanger the safety of the state."
The capacity limit was soon reached, so the camp had to be extended.
More and more adversaries of the regime came. The old factory buildings had to be torn down, and new huts were constructed to put up a total of 10,000 prisoners. The majority of the people here were political prisoners who'd been deemed antisocial elements by the state and were to be reintegrated into society and forced to renounce their political beliefs.
Before long, many prisoners belonging to oppressed minorities, such as Jews, Sinti and Roma, were also brought here. In the night of broken glass alone, 11,000 Jews were deported to Dachau. These pictures, filmed shortly after the liberation of Dachau in May 1945, offer a mere glimpse of the inhuman conditions in the camp. Although Dachau was not an extermination camp, over 40,000 prisoners lost their lives here, not counting the thousands who were deported to the extermination camps.
It was a harsh regime, but this was not the worst, neither the beatings, nor the thirst or the hunger. The Jewish prisoners lived in fear of no longer being fit for work, because as soon as the guards found out that you were no longer fit for work, you became a candidate for death.
It was mainly Jews capable of work who were to uphold Germany's battered arms industry during the final years of the war. Extermination through labor. Many prisoners were even transported to Dachau from other extermination camps in order to work for Munich-based armament factories. A dense network of over 400 slave labor camps existed in the Munich metropolitan area alone. Some of them were in the city center.
Das war wirklich kaum bekannt.
It was not widely known that a total of nearly 40 sub-camps of Dachau concentration camp had been set up in Munich. When you look at this map, you can see that they were scattered all over the city, so that everyone must have come face to face with the slave laborers, the prisoners of war, and the camp inmates on an almost daily basis.
In the area between Munich and Dachau, several sub-camps were constructed for inmates who worked as slave laborers for BMW. The camp in Allach held over 17,000 prisoners. Max Mannheimer was brought here to the Karlsfeld OT camp at the end of 1944. Of the original compound, only the kitchen section remains today. It is used as a hostel for athletes. Together with the other unskilled camp inmates, Mannheimer had to work outdoors. The trained men assembled aircraft engines in the halls.
As you can imagine, the controls were very strict, especially with the people working on the machine tools, because an aircraft engine is very sensitive. If something goes wrong, the plane will crash. Many people were executed for sabotage, although maybe they weren't acting deliberately. There were, however, many inmates who really were sabotaging the work, mainly French and Belgians, I think. There were a lot of French and Belgian inmates in the camp.
Production for the final victory continued until the end. The Americans liberated the camp on the 29th of April. One day later, the end of the Third Reich also dawned on the capital of the movement. Without encountering any resistance, US troops marched into Munich on the 1st of May 1945. 8 days before the unconditional capitulation of Nazi Germany, the American soldiers were welcomed by the population with white flags. Allied bombing raids had severely damaged Munich, and particularly the city center, which had become an expanse of rubble. A major part of the old town center was destroyed, but many of the prestigious buildings of the Nazis survived the bombings largely intact. Only the Braunes House, the symbol of the party's tyrannical rule, was totally destroyed. The occupying power later demolished some of the relics and shrines of the party's cult. The Nazis disguised their representational buildings from Allied bombers with camouflage nets. And this is why, to this day, Munich's cityscape is dotted with buildings from an era which the people in Bavaria's capital would rather forget.